Welcome back to You Must Be Woking, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations about the topic of diversity and inclusion. In this episode of You Must Be Woking, we're looking at age discrimination, and Dawn and I are going to delve into the topic of how age discrimination is really prevalent and risky for organizations around the world on this topic. If we're not careful, we can fall into some of the bear traps of how we're bringing multi-generations together in the workplace. We have a bit of fun with it, but we also delve into the more serious topics around how you as leaders and you as businesses can manage this multi-generational dilemma. Okay, welcome back to You Must Be Woken, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion with her, Dawn Hurst.
And him, Craig Richards.
Yeah, in this episode, we're going to be having an honest conversation on the topic of age discrimination, a hot topic in recent years, Dawn. I think you'll agree. It is becoming a bigger issue in the workplace these days. So we're going to delve right into that topic and help leaders understand how to manage age discrimination in the workforce, hopefully. But before we go into the main topic, what have you been up to? How have you been?
Yeah, been good. Busy. 3 big culture programs on at the moment, so all around the world, which is good fun. And took a bit of time out to climb Snowdon last week, so that was fun. What about you?
Oh, I did Snowdon back in the summer. I won't be doing it again anytime soon, I can assure you.
Not in the winter.
Yeah, I've been good. Working with you, it's always a pleasure on the culture programs. That's been pretty fun. Jacob started high school, which is a bit scary, but it's been good fun. He's settling in well, I think is fair to say. Although he's coming home, telling me he's had a couple of disasters, Dad, with where he's been moved lessons or moved classrooms. You know what he's like for routine, that kind of stuff. And I'm going on holiday in a few days' time. I can't wait.
Jealous.
Should be fun. Should we get into it? Should we make a start? Okay, so as we said, in this episode, our topic is centered on the topic of age discrimination. News story recently in the press, which made me laugh, I have to say, and I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny. But a senior executive at a FTSE engineering firm has been awarded over £3 million after winning his direct age discrimination claim. The London Central Employment Tribunal heard how Glenn Cowie had received a 45-minute lecture describing how he was an old fossil and he didn't know how to deal with millennials. Cowie was dismissed and replaced by a younger female manager after his employer implemented a policy encouraging managers not to hire people over the age of 45. In one of the largest employment tribunal cases in recent times, Cowie's award comprised of over £1 million for financial losses, £20,000 for injury to feelings, an ACAS uplift of nearly £2,000, and there was also an award for losses associated with relocation and the sale of his home. So after grossing all of that up, he got over £3 million in compensation, which I think is fair to say is pretty steep for any organisation to have to deal with.
Nice work if you can get it. Love it.
Quite. So what are we saying? How do we unpick this? Where do we start with this one?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. There's so many elements to this whole story, isn't there?
Yeah.
I wish I'd got £1 for every time I've been called something inappropriate.
Or £1 for every time I've called somebody something inappropriate.
Absolutely. I think, this is probably why we do what we do. The reality of this situation is that, the word fossil, some people would think is fun and banter, and other people would clearly take huge exception. I think the key element here is this being able to manage millennials. And therefore, we move away from age into capability. And I think that's the real crux of it.
Yeah, I agree. First and foremost, £3 million to any organisation's bottom line hit is going to hurt, right? And it's painful for any organisation. And that kind of money, you can't it can't be taken lightly. So it should be a warning shot over the bow for any other organization for a start, right? But I guess your point about the language, I guess, is an important one, because I definitely have used the words fossil or old cheese is what I used to call my mum back in the day. I have to say it was in a jokey way and wasn't perhaps used in the same manner that this was, but clearly a big issue. I guess the other thing that I picked up on this article in particular was the point that I guess the employment tribunal took as this was a policy, was because the manager had said it, or the company director had said it. Now, he may have said it in jest, I've no idea, or what the details of the argument was in the tribunal, but I guess the tribunal took that as it came from a leader, and so therefore it's policy, right? And we've got to be really careful with that kind of language in the workplace.
Absolutely. And I think, not only is that impactful to the recipient, but it's also all those people around the table who heard that, isn't it? And suddenly that makes that language okay. And that inference okay. And that's a challenge.
Well, yeah, it is. But I think the wider problem here I'm seeing, it was certainly with some of the clients that I work with as well, is the landscape's changing, right? So what we're seeing is, for probably the first time ever now, 5 or 6 generations working together in the workplace, which we just haven't seen before in organizations. And people are living longer, therefore they're working longer, staying longer. People are joining the workforce much earlier now that we have traineeships, apprenticeships, rather than straight from university. People are coming straight from school or college or whatever that looks like. And now suddenly the landscape of the different generations coming together is much more complex. And when you add to that the technology, and I've heard the term here, younger immigrants coming in, as in technology immigrants, they're coming into the workplace with new skills, new behaviors, new ways of viewing the world, and it's disrupting the norm, the status quo for people, right?
And I think there's other layers to that too, isn't there? You mentioned living longer. If we look at these government and NHS reports in the UK, we're suggesting a lifespan of 100 years, which means our careers are going to be from being 17, 18 years of age to being 80. And the majority of our focus is on our early careers colleagues or our progressing colleagues, not necessarily that 50 to 80-year-old category, who are equally, in a lot of cases, keen to be retrained, keen to do more things, keen to adjust how they work. And we're talking about this huge skills crisis we've got and talent crisis, and it's sitting there staring us in the face. We just need to be creative.
Just like B&Q was back in the 80s, right?
Absolutely.
So you talk about age in the workplace and the older generation, and B&Q's got to be probably, so for those of you outside of the UK, B&Q is owned by Kingfisher Group, and B&Q is a DIY store here in the UK. But back in the 80s and 90s, they deliberately targeted the older generation as a potential talent pool for them, right? So, particularly people that were perhaps retired or semi-retired but wanted some things to keep them busy, they were taking them on part-time, and it completely transformed B&Q's approach to talent, but also their position in the marketplace, right? So they were known as being an employer of choice for senior individuals, right?
But there's huge commercial sense in that.
Yeah.
If you look at the average profile of the customer base, there's contradictory evidence in this topic. And, I don't know if you saw the article by Indeed a few weeks ago that was pulled rapidly, which suggested that you were in decline of your career after 55 years of age. And then somebody beautifully produced the list of CEOs that ranged from 55 to about 82 years of age, who were actually leading the biggest organizations in the world. And, this whole topic is fascinating, but we shouldn't forget it goes both ways.
Right.
You know, we automatically assume that age discrimination is for the older generation. But I love to recite the cases that are the 14-year-olds. You know, there are lots of cases in employment law of 14-year-old employees, whether it be being refused entry to a talent competition or being told that they can't work in a cafe because somebody's discovered they're 14 despite the fact they've delivered a brilliant service for 6 months. And we get hung up on thinking immediately of that older generation.
Yeah, and you're right, it does work both ways. I guess that it makes me think of, right, so, and we did say in this podcast we were going to have the kind of tough conversations as well, or the conversations that perhaps most people might think but don't say.
Yeah.
So let's think about this, right? If we're being really honest, this whole topic of age is actually quite polarizing for organizations. And I know many business leaders that have said, you know, we don't really know how to navigate this because it's quite a difficult environment for people. And actually, what people are saying or thinking, but perhaps not saying out loud, or certainly not saying it in the boardroom, let's be clear, is there's this belief that the older generation think that the younger generation are privileged and entitled and don't know how to do a hard day's work. And on the flip side to that, you've got the younger generation who believe that the older generation are just, you know, refuse to move, refuse to learn or do anything differently. And therefore, these multi-generations are just clashing. And there's this kind of big tension in organizations. I believe that's getting worse, not better. I don't know what you think.
I completely agree with you. And I think, to be fair, there's some truth in some elements of that. You know, certainly in my experience, all of my team are significantly younger than me. And I am quite sure they see me as the dinosaur or indeed the fossil, depending on whatever the language is. But I know I could outperform them in describing what AI meant or technology or all of those things because I've made a choice. And I made a choice to educate myself and stay ahead of the game on these topics. I don't think that's always necessarily the case, and therefore that causes some stereotypical issues with the generations.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to probably come to this a little bit later in the episode in terms of what can organizations do. But I think you make a really important point about education, and it's something I bang on about all the time. So I don't apologize, but I do apologize. But it does. Education plays a big part in this, right? Because if you want these multi-generations to be able to work together, we're going to have to show them how. We're going to have to help them understand each other. And I don't think we do at the moment. Or they make assumptions about people's capabilities. We make assumptions about the type of individuals and who they are and why they do things rather than understanding why they do things. And the reason I say that is because we had a situation in our office, if you remember, where we had a grad start in our organization and the office manager was getting really frustrated with this grad. And the office manager's attitude was they keep putting their headphones in. They're not engaging in conversation. How can they be part of the team if they're going to just put their headphones in, et cetera, et cetera. And it was getting quite testy between the two until we spoke to them both and said, right, come on, let's have a conversation. What's going on here? And what we didn't realize really quickly was actually the grad thought by putting their headphones in, their manager would be impressed with them because they were concentrating, right? To them, putting the headphones in meant you were concentrating. But to the office manager, putting your headphones in meant you were disengaging from conversation. You were isolating yourself from what was going on. And actually just that very conversation helped both of them understand they were coming at this from a different angle. And actually we came to a compromise where they could put their one ear pod in but still be aware of what's going on. And there were certain times when we wanted them engaged. So we found a solution, but only after we helped educate each other on why they were thinking or what they were viewing. Does that?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because to me, it comes right back to where we started about capability. Because that difference in style, to some extent, is completely irrelevant, isn't it? Because the reality is, I always pose this question to the leaders I work with: would you accept direction from a 20-year-old CEO?
Yeah.
And you'll see there's this moment of, I know I need to be inclusive. And then we
say the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I also feel for different generations too, because there is some immensely talented individuals who get overlooked because of their young age as well as their older age. And I'm of the attitude, if you're good enough, you're old enough, to a point.
Yeah.
There has to be experience, there has to be credibility, there has to be understanding. But I would happily take direction from a 28-year-old leader who I respected. But I think it's that bit that is the challenge around capability.
Yeah.
I also think and I'm on a rant now, I also think
I'll just put my feet up.
There's a big difference here between generational working and basic disciplines.
Yeah.
Because,
I know where she's going with this.
Yeah, sorry. This is my common rant. I've had one of my team turn up late for a meeting because there was a queue in Starbucks. Now, is that me being inflexible because they were 10 minutes late to a meeting and being a bit naffed off with that? Or is that just bad manners? And again,
do you want me to answer that?
I'll leave you to decide. But in my day, we had some basic disciplines. You turned up on time for a meeting. You dressed appropriately for the environment. I'm not talking about being suited and booted. I'm talking about being appropriate. And you delivered respect to everybody based on their capability. That's my view. And I think we can often confuse the two, capability and basic respect and discipline.
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of that. I think if we're talking about those honest conversations and we're saying what some people think, what they think is that the younger generation lack the ability to have that kind of discipline or the respect to turn up on time for a meeting or the respect to, to dress appropriately in the workplace. And I hear all the time people say they can't even answer the bloody phone anymore. Well, I get that, but we also have to look at it at a slightly different angle here, right? Because, if I think about my son and I say to him, Jacob, how do you answer the phone? He goes like that. Right, and he presses his hand. Whereas my generation, you answer the phone, you went like that, right?
Absolutely.
So actually, there is a difference in generation here, and we've got to understand that actually, part of the reason people can't answer the phone is because they never have had to. That's not how their lives work these days. So again, I just come back to that point about education. There is something in that. For me, the biggest bit is the assumptions bit. We make assumptions about what people understand. So in your scenario here, you were talking about people turning up late. Are we making the assumption that they're being disrespectful, or are they making the assumption that that's okay? And have we bridged the gap here, right? So have we said to people, actually, no, it isn't okay to turn up 10 minutes late with your Starbucks. Our expectations in our workplace is that you arrive on time for your meeting. If you want a Starbucks, leave your house 10 minutes earlier, right? If we lay those expectations down and we help people understand what they are, then people have a choice as to whether or not they go along with those expectations or whether this is the right environment for them to working. And you can have a conversation about flexible working and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, if we're not clear on what our expectations are, then how can people live up to them?
I think that's very true. And I think it comes back to embedding a culture of curiosity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I am fascinated by different people, not just generations. And I'm the one who's constantly going, do you mind if I just ask? Could I possibly just clarify? And if we do more of that, we learn that actually we're so similar.
Yeah. And the assumptions bit and that curiosity bit is an important one because HBR and Deloitte, Harvard Business Review and Deloitte, not using jargons here, they did this study, didn't they? Did you see that research? Over 10,000 teams or something, and where they talked about the different generations in the workplace. And over 2/3 of people in that 10,000 survey thought that the older generation meant it gave them a competitive disadvantage.
Yeah.
How mad is that, right?
Oh.
All that knowledge and talent, and people think it's a disadvantage. And again, I think it's that assumptions piece that drives that kind of thinking, right?
I think it's assumptions. I think it's media.
Stereotyping,
I think it's stereotyping. I think it's discrimination. It's all of that good stuff. Because if you think about how media portrays age, or we think about characters that are in the public eye, we play to the stereotypes, and the impact of that can be huge. Whereas if we genuinely are curious and work together, the power of those multi-generational teams is enormous and is a massive competitive advantage.
I wrote a question down on my notes, right, before the episode today, and it says, ask Dawn, is it different in different sectors? What's your opinion on that? So do you think age discrimination is more prevalent in, I don't know, sectors like construction versus banking?
I think if we take out of that question the physical requirement industries, where we talk about, this, what is now quite a misdemeanor about being physically unable at 55 years of age to climb the ladder or jump the fence.
You're going to keep doing that, aren't you, till you're 80?
Absolutely. And beyond.
I don't know about you. I'm too old for this shit. I'm going home.
Exactly that. But let's take the media. The media is the classic in terms of having now lost about 10 cases in the last 2 years around age discrimination simply by the way somebody looks, not by capability. If we look at how you perceive somebody as a sales professional, I always describe this as there being two levels. You've got an influencer level who are very young and beautiful, and then you've got the actual
not always beautiful.
You've got the
young and hip, maybe.
Yeah, you've got the decision makers who actually are holding the purse strings and having to be at the rough end of business, and I think that applies cross-sector.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's organisations out there who are really leaning into that young influencer vibe. Do you see that advert or that I think it was an advert on social media from Curry's, the department store, the electric people store, and they were leaning into all the the jizzle language or whatever. I can't even remember what it was now, but it just made me howl with laughter. Yeah. But I thought actually they're leaning into that kind of differential with the multi-gens, aren't they? Because they had this older chap talking in really young, hip language. Yeah. I keep saying hip. That's not even a word, is it? My nieces and nephews are going to laugh at me. But that they're leaning into that kind of, that vibe, aren't they? And they're trying to blend the cultures to say It doesn't really matter whether you're older or whether you're younger. We've got the right kit and stuff here for you in our stores. And I like that approach to it. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it? Is age treated differently than perhaps some of the other protected characteristics, right? So would you play about in a marketing advert on race or on religion the way you do on age?
I think that's a big question, isn't it? And I think, when we talk about age, it becomes more accepted to banter or to be more direct about age. Absolutely not is my view around race or religion or any of those more definitive topics.
And yet the fine in this story that we started today's episode with was over 3 million quid.
Yeah.
So organizations or employers in different societies are playing with age, even though the risk is just as equally as big, but we wouldn't play with race or religion or gender in the same way, right? We just wouldn't, would we?
Absolutely.
But it is interesting.
And it's, how many businesses can take a few of those hits a year?
Well, there's also a case, because I obviously did my research for this episode, clearly. But there was a case I read about a couple of years ago where a local butcher's, and I mean just a local butcher's in a little village shop, got fined 120k So I guess if you think about scalability compared to this, it's comparable, fine, right? But for their size, for doing exactly the same thing, they basically replaced their older butcher with a younger butcher and got rid of them just because of age. And they were fined 120K for it. So, the risks are there, but yet we seem to treat age completely differently than how we do some of the other protected characteristics.
It's a safe discrimination, isn't it?
Well, the reason I asked you the question, anyway, back to the different sectors, right, was because I gave a speech back last summer to a company. I won't name the company, but I gave a speech on age, basically in multi-generational workplaces, and I titled this speech rather inappropriately now in hindsight, boomers to zoomers, right? and the first 10 minutes, honestly, it went down like a lead balloon, right, in the first 10 minutes. And so, but it recovered because I think in that environment, people thought, what is this guy on about, right? Well, this isn't an issue. Like, why are we even talking about this? It's not an issue for us. And it wasn't until we got into the conversation about the differences between the generations and why generations are different and helping people understand those differences, did I think that organization started to understand the conversation we were having, right? And, my choice of language, boomers to zoomers, probably didn't help me in the first 10 minutes of the speech, but it just made me wonder, was that relevant just because it was this was an engineering company that I'd done the speech for, very different to had I gone into a banking environment, I guess. But, those sector things, people might think they're different, but they're not really, are they?
I think it's a misdemeanor. Yeah. I really do. I think the reality is that, it comes down to the individual. And I think it comes down to the individual mindset. I know that when I started my career, I had the privilege of being mentored by a really fabulous individual who transformed my career. They were at least 30 plus years older than I was. And was it a bit of a culture shock at the beginning? Yeah, it sure was. I remember going home in tears one night because of the robust style of management. Yeah. But equally, they transformed who I was as a professional.
Yeah. And I guess we should reflect in this conversation that society has moved on and cultures have moved on a lot since, perhaps when we started out in our workplaces and stuff. I started in the hospitality industry, wildly different from the type of work that I do now, but very different cultures. But society as a whole has moved on a lot, right? So, it was not uncommon for, engineers or people that worked in construction sites or in, frontline roles like that to have to leave their house on a Sunday to be ready for work on a Monday. I mean, that doesn't tend to happen a lot these days, or to be away from home for a week or 2 weeks at a time. And, we have a different society expectations of individuals, particularly new generations of talent. Their expectations are different on the workplace, right? So they don't expect to have to give up their weekends to be ready for work on a Monday, right?
No, and I think that's interesting because even as soon as post-COVID, how we work today compared to even 5 years ago is dramatically different. Yeah. And I think it's an interesting topic. We talk sometimes about time off in lieu. Yeah. And,
that's my head in.
I wouldn't
No, I'm an old fossil, right? Because it does my head in.
I wouldn't have dreamed of claiming for that 20 minutes I worked over. And again, does that make us right or wrong? I don't know. But
I think, just to clarify my position on toil, I think it's, my attitude is, and we do this in our consulting business, right, where we say to people, look, you don't have to ask our permission to go to the doctors on a Friday or to the dentist or whatever, or to go and see your kids' show. We don't need to give you permission for that. You can just do it. But equally, in return, we're not expecting you to clock your 20 minutes that you did over because a client kept you talking and taking it back as time off in lieu. That's, there's got to be a bit of give and take, and we're completely flexible. I guess that's my position on if somebody, and I guess this comes back to that point about expectations being different, right? Yes. Because one of the things that I guess I see a lot in different clients that I work with is expectations are different. Society's moved on, but actually the resource for the roles hasn't changed, right? So we might say, okay, you don't need to travel on a Sunday to get to your work, but we're not going to reduce the amount of hours you've got to do on the Monday, right? So the individuals are still faced with, okay, so you've said I can be more flexible and we can do X, Y, and Z, but you haven't taken away any of the work I've got to do. So now I've got to fit 60 hours into 37 and a half hours or whatever that is. And I think there is a bit of a responsibility on employers to think about, whether or not you've got right people, right place, right time, all of that. Good stuff as well, right?
And 15 different methods of communication giving you information at the same time is massive.
Yeah.
My son has just started his first role and is 25 years of age, well-educated individual, gone into an organisation. And on day one of induction was told that they get 30 minutes for lunch and was trying to work out how you could possibly walk to prep, order your prep, get back to the office and eat it within 30 minutes. And just that realisation of that's life is fascinating, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah. And those expectations, I guess, just to layer this point, and we will move on in a minute, I guess, and start talking about the so what, right? But there's an interesting dynamic that COVID's had on this, and you mentioned it a bit earlier on, that the COVID has had an impact on workplaces and companies that, particularly leaders trying to navigate what all of that looks like. It's interesting, right? Because I have friends and family who love the fact that suddenly they've been allowed to work from home and it's completely changed their life. And they're very clear to me, if their organization says, everyone back to the office, they're going to leave and they're going to find another job, right? Which is, I guess, risky for organizations who worry about productivity and want to do that. But equally, we've had people in our organization, and we're all remote, right? We've had people in our organization leave us because they want the office environment. And it happens to be the younger generation, right?
Absolutely.
So they leave university or school or whatever it is, they come into the workplace and they're not making friends because they're working remotely or they're not having the social element that comes with work. And yet you've got the kind of next age bracket of millennials or whatever we want to call them, who are saying, don't bring me back to the office, right? I'm quite happy being at home and, being able to do my washing at lunchtime or whatever that is. And how do you navigate that as an organization and employer? That's really tough, right?
But I think that spreads all generations, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I love the days when I can only get dressed from the waist up,
Visions you sat in your 90 now when you were on our course.
But, I certainly am far more productive on those desk days when I'm not commuting as I used to do. And, I have a lot of time for people who choose different ways of it working for them.
Okay. Come on. We've given our opinions. Let's do the so what bit. What can leaders who are listening to this podcast do about age discrimination? How do we navigate this topic? Because there's so much going on. Society's moving so quickly.
Yeah.
Give us some tips. What should employers be thinking about when we're talking about age as a starter for 10?
I guess my advice would be keep it simple. The first is educate, and encourage curiosity within the business. Make it okay for people to say, what does that feel like for you? How does that feel? Tell me more. All of those good things. But also, in some ways, make that happen, whether that be through mentoring programs, which are multi-generational, or whether that be through a buddy system, like I mentioned earlier. That was immensely helpful to me to have somebody. And yes, you went through that period of banter at the beginning where, you get to be asked to do stuff that you don't realise is not appropriate. But I also think the boring stuff, the policies, the procedures have got to adapt to multi-generations. If we think about the fact that we want some Marbella leave in the summer where we can have 3 months off. We don't want to be working 12 months of the year. But that gives our younger generations the opportunity to be those shadows for the positions and step up and gain some experience they wouldn't normally. putting some tenures in place for roles so that it is about capability. If I'm 50 years of age and I'm in a role, I could, in theory, stay for the next 30 years, and that's blocking the progression of everybody else. I need to be capable and constantly learning and improving to stay in that role. And if I know I've got a tenure of 5 years, I know I've got to keep competitive in the marketplace to be able to move within the organisation or outside of it. And again, just making sure that those opportunities, whether it be career opportunities or education opportunities, are available across that spectrum of 17 to 80 years of age, not just in one place.
Yeah, nice. I love that. I also think there's something for me about, as a society, as workplaces, and not just here in the UK either, actually, in the West in general, I think we're overmanaged and underled. And so, again, I talk about education, but actually leadership is really powerful. And we've got to teach leaders how to lead in the right way, right? Because one-size-fits-all models don't work anymore. No. So we've got to understand that actually some of our younger employees are going to need one thing. Some of our employees who've been with us for, middle age, whatever that is, they're going to need something different. And some of our older employees are going to need something different again. So we have to teach leaders how to lead differently, right? And individually, and to get the best from all of those different groups. And I hear this a lot, you can't teach old dog new tricks and all of that. And it's just utter nonsense, right? It's complete nonsense. And I always use the story here about my good old Uncle Jerry, right? who I love dearly. But back in the day, when I came out as gay, I was really nervous about telling my family, as most gay people coming out would be. But one of the people I was really nervous about was my Uncle Jerry, because when I was growing up, I'd heard from him language that would now be called racist, homophobic, whatever, right? But back in them days, it was either jest or whatever. It was just a done thing. So I was a bit nervous about coming out and what his reaction would be. And look, I needn't have been, because as soon as he had some education, i.e. an experience of somebody that he loved being different, he changed, right? And his behavior changed. So in my mind is if my Uncle Jerry can change, everybody can change, right? Absolutely. A little bit of education and somebody then get to make a choice. Now, if they choose at that point to be uninclusive or discriminative or whatever, then that's a different conversation. But actually, if we give people a bit of experience or a bit of education, they can make an informed choice about the way they behave and the way they do that. And I genuinely think it starts with leaders. We have to help leaders understand how to do that, how to lead in a different way.
I agree with you. I think we also have to give people credit because there are very, very few malicious people in this world. There are people who like a laugh at other people's expense, but there's very few malicious people. Now, sometimes the banter can be simply a case of ignorance. Yeah. And if we can break down this whole siloed approach to generations, the benefits are huge.
Huge. But I equally think, and this is a warning, right, to leaders out there, and we've had experience of this. There are people that do the work that you and I do in the D&I space or the culture and leadership space who I'm going to call them, I'm going to be really careful about how I say this, but they're more militant, shall we say, right? And they're not pragmatic. They're not focused on the how-to. And what they do is they over-police people's behavior and language and all of that kind of stuff. And actually, it has the opposite effect of what they're trying to achieve, which means that they're ending up excluding or alienating a large proportion of their workforce because they're over-policing stuff. And as leaders, I get very frustrated that you're not careful with this stuff. You've got to be really clear with whoever's running your D&I strategies or working on this topic with you that we're not over-policing this. It's about choice. We give people an education. We give them a choice to make. If they then choose to behave that's not in line with our values and behaviors, then that's a disciplinary or that's something we need to take down a different angle. We shouldn't over-police this stuff. We should give people the choice. And to your point, most people will make the right choice, right? Nobody comes, 95% of the population don't get up in the morning and think, I'm going to go to work and be bad today or behave inappropriately today.
But that's because this whole topic becomes a caricature of itself, doesn't it? We've only got to look at some of the old episodes of The Office around diversity and inclusion and all of that good stuff. But the reality is I've seen that delivered by individuals. And the challenge with that is that you push this topic underground. Which makes it grow much more rapidly into something that isn't pleasant.
There's something for me about helping our teams understand how to disagree politely.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Because society is really polarized at the moment. And it's almost like we're adding to that with this them and us culture. And we've got to teach people how to disagree better. Right? Because it's okay if we disagree, right? I mean, you and I disagree on a daily basis, right? But we're still friends at the end of the day. It's,
exactly.
But we seem to have lost that art form in the workplace. And maybe that's a cultural thing. Maybe it's a multi-gen thing. But if we help people understand how to disagree better, then maybe that's a good start. There's a workplace expert in the US called Lindsay Pollack, I think her name is. Let me just check my notes. Yeah, Lindsay Pollack. And I rate Lindsay's work. She does a huge amount of work. But she's got like a list of things that employers should be thinking about when it comes to multi-gen workforces. So I'll whittle through them. So one is about being transparent and accepting that you've got multi-gen, and we should talk about that and not be ashamed to talk about it. Remember that the one-size leadership bit doesn't work, as we were just talking about. She talks about your curiosity bit, which I really love because that's a really powerful thing. And then the two that really stood out for me in Lindsay's work, right, which I thought was really interesting. The first one was, remember, common sense is not so common, right? Actually, so what we think about, they can't even answer the bloody phone. They got no common sense. But actually, why would they when they've never, that's not common. It's common to you and your generation, but people don't answer the phone anymore. I mean, I don't know about you. If people ring me, if I don't know the number, I'm just like, ignore that. So people don't answer the phone like they used to. So common sense is not so common, and we should remember that. And then her final one, which I really loved, and I have this to tell you because you do this a lot, and we've got to stop generation shaming both ourselves and others, right? And you do this, you'll say, oh, I am an old fossil and I can't do this, or I don't know, whatever. And actually you do. You know more about IT than I do, right? But you always joke about, I'm not very good with IT. And that's quite a common thing that people do in the workplace, right? We generation shame without realizing what we're doing. We think it's just a bit of fun or whatever, but actually it's huge.
It is huge, but I think sometimes we do it to remove any stigma around it. It makes us more vulnerable. It makes us more relatable to
but we've got to stop that, right? We shouldn't do it to ourselves. It's the same thing about people going, I'm too big to do this, right? We're shaming ourselves, and we should stop that. So as a workplace, that's definitely a big tip for me, is to call it out or encourage people to stop with that stuff, because actually a lot of the time it's not true. It's just assumptions that don't ring true. It's the same point I make about you and IT, and you know more about AI than probably anybody in our organization, and you're one of the oldest people in our organization, so it isn't true. So we should stop saying things that aren't true around some of that stuff.
Oh, I've been told off now.
You have been told off. That's me giving you a lecture now. Okay. So a couple of other bits from me then on the kind of how-to bit, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this actually. So we talk about education, but we need to be careful with education, right? And this is something that you and I bang on about quite a lot. And organizations spend an inordinate amount of money on education, right? A huge amount of money. I'm thinking about bias as an example here, right? Unconscious bias training. I won't get you started because I know you'll be shouting into the microphone in a moment. But organizations, particularly some of the bigger organizations, spend a huge amount of money on training, and then they come to us a year later and say, hey, Craig, Dawn, we spent £500,000 on unconscious bias training and we don't think it's made a blind bit of difference. And we go, interesting that, right? And part of the reason it doesn't make a blind bit of difference is there's two reasons for me. So the first thing is, how are you measuring whether that's making a blind bit of difference? And how did you get to the point of spending £500,000 before you realized it wasn't working? Surely if you were measuring
and who let you do that?
Yeah, precisely, right? So that's a scary thing for me. So how are you measuring that? And we bang on about measurement all of the time in this topic. And I guess the second bit for me around training and education is, it always focuses too much on the theory and not enough on the practical how-to. So it's all well and good saying to a leader, you need to be approachable, or you need to treat people as individuals rather than a one-size-fits-all. But where's the bit that says, and here's how you do that, right? Here's how you demonstrate that you're a really approachable leader, or here's how you demonstrate, these kind of skills in the workplace. And I get really frustrated when I see workplace training that focuses too much on the theory about what good looks like, but doesn't actually show people then how to do the good bit.
Absolutely. And very finger wagging, assuming that you're completely inappropriate from the beginning.
Yeah.
No, I agree entirely. That measuring the impact of any training is so important. And it's not with a happy sheet 3 minutes after you've finished.
No.
It's at 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, really robust impact measurement.
And I guess that just to bang on slightly more, training on its own isn't enough, right?
No.
So when we talk to organizations that we work with about the interventions that they put in place to tackle some of these things, we always talk about layering interventions, right? Because if you want to get impact, you can't just do something in isolation. So training somebody with the right training and measuring it is one part of the jigsaw puzzle. But actually, you also need to think about the systems that exist in your organization, and are those systems driving you towards that change in behavior or deterring individuals away from that behavior. And often organizations will put training in place but leave the systems that they used to be, which deters them from doing what they're teaching them to do new anyway, right? So we've got to make sure both are hand in hand, and we're layering those interventions so that they get the outcome and the impact, right?
I agree. And also, sometimes we have to allow people to make mistakes as well. You're not going to do an hour's training course and then suddenly be redeemed from the moment you walk out the room. The reality is sometimes we need a bit of a tap-tap from our friends and colleagues.
The stats are phenomenal, right? Something like 20% of what you learn in the training course, you remember.
Absolutely.
And it's only when you go back to the workplace and do it, or you put it into practice, do you actually then embed the learning, right? So there's something about how we follow up the training as well and make sure that that's done in the right way. And I know this is something that's close to your heart. You make sure all of our training has the do it actions in place.
Yeah.
Right?
And not being the police about these topics. I think if we just relax into, we allow a mistake. We don't allow that mistake repeated, but we allow people to make mistakes, and we explain very clearly what the correction should be.
Yeah.
And we allow them to get on.
Make mistakes, but learn fast.
Exactly.
Move on from them. Yeah. And don't hold people to blame for all of that sort of stuff, right? Just accept that that's going to happen. Okay. The final bit, I think for me, or final tip on this one for me, is about understanding that your organization is going to evolve over time. Exactly. It's going to be different. It's not going to be the same as it was 10 years ago. And if it is, it probably won't last another 10 years anyway. So, we have to accept that evolution is a natural phenomenon, and it's going to continue to happen for our workplaces and our organizations. And somebody made me think about, what does that mean, right? In modern culture. And I always think about the James Bond movies, right? So when I was growing up, I hated James Bond. I thought it was complete cheese, and my mum and dad thought it was wonderful, and I hated it and thought it was complete cheese, until they remade it with Daniel Craig. And it was a whole different type of James Bond, right? And not for obvious reasons, did I fall in love with James Bond at that point. But, that remake of James Bond, that evolution of the character, evolution of the movie franchise, brought a whole new raft of fans, probably kept quite a lot of the old fans, but brought a whole new... And that natural evolution meant that the Bond franchise was relevant in 2020s as it was in 1980s, right? And there's something about that for me that we need to accept about our workplaces, that we're going to have to keep evolving and modernizing to stay relevant. And we need to therefore help our fans or our audiences, our people, understand that natural evolution is okay. and it's nothing to be feared, and we should just embrace it. But try and keep the principles and the values the same, because Bond's principles and values in that remake under Daniel Craig was the same. It was just a different way of looking at those values and principles of who Bond was and the things that he did, right?
And I think, the point here, of course, is that we don't have all the answers as an individual.
Yeah.
So co-create this stuff. Get a team of multi-generations together. How are we going to perform this year, in 5 years, in 10 years? What do we need to think about? Talk to students still in education. What are they going to be looking for?
Yeah.
All of this good stuff is so valuable.
And be more Bond.
Be more Bond.
Be more Daniel
Not
Craig.
Not necessarily Daniel Craig, but be more Bond.
Daniel Craig for me. I'm quite happy with that. Okay. So I think we're about to go into listeners' questions. This is the point where we call the fabulous Evan in and say, Evan, bring in the questions. So this part in the show is where we hand over the mic to our listeners and we say to them, you have an opportunity to send us your questions in advance. Any question, no silly questions. Regardless of what it is, we will do our best to answer it. We don't know these questions, so Evan's bringing them in for us. Thank you.
Thank you,
kindly. Evan. We don't know what they are, so I'm going to open them up.
This is slightly scary. Didn't know this was happening.
You do now. Making a right hash of tearing the envelope open. But these are the questions we've got from our listeners. Okay. So, Dawn, first question then. Do you feel there is a difference in what drives engagement in the workplace for different generations?
I think it's a yes and no answer. I think in terms of what different generations might want in terms of flexibility, in terms of security, in terms of benefits, some of those things may differ depending on what stage in your life you may be at. I think the fundamental principles of engagement remain the same.
They should be that way for any group,
regardless,
right? Yeah.
An environment you feel safe in, an environment that you can be yourself, you're respected, and you are rewarded for your contribution.
I agree, and I feel like the engagement bit for different generations is the engagement is going to be, you're going to need different forms of engagement for lots of different things, not just generations. So think about people with disabilities and have different adjustment needs and all of that, then your engagement is going to be different. And so I think you just need to view engagement more broadly as we need lots of different approaches to engagement across our workforce, and generations is one of those, but not exclusively about generations.
And the benefits I might want at 20 years of age compared to at 40 might be entirely different.
Okay. Right. Question number 2. Should age-related banter be banned in the workplace? We've kind of answered this, but what's your thoughts?
My thoughts on banter is that we should not ban any kind of banter from the workforse.
We should do a whole episode on banter, I think, because I think that'll be a lot of fun.
So.
And I'll send you to get the tartan paint. Or the left-handed screwdriver.
Banter's great.
Yeah.
When we don't cross the line, but we'll cover that again.
Yeah, let's cover that in a future one. Okay, what are the most effective initiatives you've seen that aims to embrace intergenerational diversity, and what has been the benefits of this?
I think we've probably covered, this is from a personal perspective, that one-to-one mentoring of somebody who was at a different point in their career was very, very helpful for me. I've run a lot of reverse mentoring programs for our clients around the world where we have had more mature individuals be mentored by younger generations. That's been hugely effective. But also some simple Q&A. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be sophisticated, but those for me are the two most impactful.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think mentoring, massive, particularly that reciprocal reverse mentoring piece, huge. And we do quite a lot of that for different organizations. We've seen some huge results as a result of that. I think that point we made earlier about building multi-generational muscle in the workplace by encouraging people to be curious, talk to each other, help them understand the expectations of different generations, and then that way they might get better at doing some of that. So I think for me, those are the kind of things that you should be thinking about to I guess, maximize the opportunity that comes from a multi-generational workforce. Okay. Final question. How can leaders create an environment where younger employees, such as Gen Z professionals, feel respected and valued without being dismissed based on age? I think we've answered that one in quite a lot throughout the conversation.
I don't know many, if any, leaders who would be disrespectful. And if they are, like you say, we need to create an environment where people go, oi.
Yeah, speak up.
Yeah.
Right? Say something. You don't have to hide it. Okay, brilliant. So they're the questions for this time round.
Well, that was all right.
That wasn't too bad.
No,
There's nothing
okay.
scary in there. So that's it for the questions. Next time, if you've got questions or you want to send some questions in, we're doing language and inclusive language in the workplace. And in particular, has censorship on language gone too far? So if you want to send us a question completely anonymously, you can send it to evan@metimer.global. He will collate them, put them in the envelope so that we don't get to see them in advance, and we will do our best, Dawn, to answer them.
Make them good. That's exciting.
Good. Yeah, it's fun. Okay. So before we wrap up this episode of You Must Be Woking, it's time for our recurring feature. I'm quite excited by this, right? So this is the recurring feature in each of our episodes, as you may well know, where one of us will test the other on whether or not the topic that they bring to the table is a woke topic or a joke topic. We're going to keep scores across the season, and the person with the least scores at the end of the season is going to have to buy the other person a meal of their choosing. So wherever you're going to go.
Come on, listeners, you've got to help me with this. I need a good meal at the end of the season.
Okay. So Dawn, I believe you're bringing the woke or joke to the table this time round.
I am indeed. And
dreading this.
The question I want to ask you is, so is it true that an individual fell over on their walk from their bedroom to their workstation at home and has been able to claim compensation?
No, absolutely not. No, you can't. So they've claimed compensation for falling between their bedroom and their home office. Nah,
absolutely.
No chance. That's a joke. That's got to be a joke.
It's not. It's true.
No way. No way.
And they won their case.
Oh my God.
Because it was classed as their commute.
Oh my gosh. That's ridiculous. That's got to be a joke. I'm sorry. Wow. Okay. We will come back to woke or joke on every episode in the future for you. That's it for another episode.
Wow.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as always.
And you. Good to see you.
See you next time for language.
Language.
You prepped?
Yes. Look forward to that. Get those questions in.
Okay. It's bye from me.
Bye from me.
You Must Be Woking is brought to you by Metimer, where measuring inclusion matters. You can visit Metimer's website at metimer.global or check out their social channels at Metimer Global.